Well, with Trump going full court press in the last few weeks, it makes you wonder if civil war is possible at this point. I mean, holy shit, he's pretty much doing exactly everything the left doesn't want him to do. He's closed the border, which wasn't controversial 15 years ago, but today, now it's a big fucking deal. He ended birthright citizenship and also the anchor baby, basically incentives. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. He pardoned the January 6ers. He withdrew from the WHO. And yesterday, his press secretary basically exposed how bad the excessive spending was and has been for stupidity. I mean, wasn't there something stupid like dragging foreign countries and dumb shit like that? Oh no, we're losing the ability to put drag shows in Colombia and other foreign countries? Bitch, get the fuck out of here. And now, he's trying to get rid of the Department of Education? We're not even 40 seconds in and my shirt's already off. I mean, the left in the state love their education. Look what they've done to universities, and certainly what is in the school curriculum for children. As far as I understand, education before 1979, when it was established, was almost exclusively state and local. However, when you federalize it and try to make those states adhere to certain curriculums, they basically try to homogenize and indoctrinate all children and the people that go to university. So we all know they're going to cry about it, and I'm not really sure if it's going to go through or not. If it does, I mean, he's going to make huge crosshairs for himself. I mean, how could he possibly get through the next 4 years without at least another assassination attempt? He's the supreme antithesis of what they stand for at this point. He's not doing the cookie cutter stuff he did in the first term. This is full-blown, let's axe the whole thing and see what happens. And it's not really axing, it's just going to the way things were before 1979, I guess. I mean, shit, if you look at footage from the 1950s of children, they're way more articulate than, like, our high school kids are now, depending on what school you go to. But yeah, they sound way smarter back then. I mean, how bad could this really be? We have nothing to lose. The test scores and everything fucking suck now, and it's not like they're getting any better. So by any metric, we might as well just try something new and see what happens. Almost anything seems like an improvement from now. Anyway, from the left's perspective, I mean, when you see someone who's completely tyrannical, wouldn't you think that those are the grounds for civil war? When we look at the first civil war we had in the 1860s, it mostly stemmed from the unanswered question of slavery. The North had no slaves and was very industrial. The South's economy was basically a glass cannon solely behind cotton exporting it. Britain needed a lot of cotton, and the South had shitloads of it. Of course, during the American Revolution, it was way more important for them all to band together, put their differences aside, and take on the suicide mission of fighting Britain. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We've seen this multiple times in history. The Chinese in World War II are a great example. They were having a civil war between the communists and the non-communists. The both of them stopped, band together, and say, look, I hate you, but I hate the Japanese more. Anyway, they never answered the question of slavery because it was extremely vague in the Constitution, and it was debatable whether it was supposed to be phased out or not. So when they started adding non-slave states and slave states, it was mostly to keep the balance. But here's the thing, when you kick the can down the road for 80 years, at some point something's going to give. When they got to 1850, Kansas and Nebraska were starting to get real controversial, and so they decided that both states should make up their minds rather than the decision already being decided for them. What happened from that is you had shitloads of people from the North and South flocking to those two states to try and vote in their respective ideologies. Well, one thing leads to another and you start having people kill each other. And that's what's uncomparable to today. Even though things are really tense in 2025, with one of the most radical people we've ever had in office, as in someone who actually stands for something, rather than going along with the establishment crap, on a massive scale, nobody is really killing each other. And I say that it feels very tense, because even though Trump won the 2024 election, the left is probably sitting there, brooding, and thinking that we need to get rid of Hitler out of the office, by any means necessary. And when we look at Bleeding Kansas and the casualties, it was at least 56 and could have been up to 200, but this number is debatable, it looks like. So while no one's killing anyone overtly, in the manner of Bleeding Kansas, because that law was directly related to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Could you imagine what the assassination of President Trump would mean? Things are held in such a delicate balance right now. I mean, he barely got voted in, and what he represents is complete and total anti-establishment. He wants to make the government smaller, which he's done an excellent job of doing already. And he's basically the only president since, Ronald Reagan, who's taken such extreme, direct anti-government measures. Joe Biden, complete and total government, just let the fucking border fly open. Obama, establishment. Bush, globalist, reduce freedom, Patriot Act. Clinton and Bush. Well, I know Bush had no new taxes. I really don't know enough about the Clinton administration yet. But he does have the name Clinton in his name. And we're supposed to compare all those previous presidents with someone who got Pam Bondi in there and has, quote, directed the DOJ to pause all federal funding for sanctuary cities immediately after being sworn in. As someone who just appreciates denying massive amounts of spending, that brings a smile to my face every day. But again, that's one of the biggest establishment things to do. Give shitloads of funding away from the federal government and the taxpayer. So while we benefit from this entirely, maybe it might even get us budget cuts. Wow, we could stop a little bit of spending? Holy fuck. It only makes the crosshairs on Trump way, way bigger, doesn't it? I mean, you basically had a bunch of presidents in a row, more or less not moving the line too much, and Trump's coming in there with an absolute sledgehammer. I mean, he might as well just be a bull in a china shop. But when we look at the Civil War, some things are really hard to compare today. For example, back then, state allegiances and loyalty to your state was way, way, way different. Today, if you have a problem in California, you can move anywhere. If you have a problem in Minnesota, you just go to another state. Because it's so easy for us to move around, really within a matter of hours if we want, and because we're so welcome to get up and go, we just do it. Back then it was a massively different investment. If you're going to do it back then, you were basically going to do it by wagon, and this was hundreds of miles with a wagon. Yeah, that's a pretty big commitment. Back then it was much easier to stay in your community. Today though, it's much different. While we do have states and such which tend to be red and blue, the overwhelming trend tends to be that rural areas are very, very red, and liberal areas tend to exclusively be in cities, but they tend to be really, really left. When we have all the left being in the cities and all the right being outside the cities, what would a civil war look like? A bunch of city slickers trying to take over rural areas? The rural folk, which want to have nothing to do with cities, all of a sudden needing to infiltrate cities? Anyway, the point is that the geographic divide from the North and South in the original Civil War made it very easy to tell who was on which side. But today, if we had a civil war, it would be maybe internally in states, rural versus liberal. I don't know, the lines that would be hypothetically drawn would be very difficult to put a consistent and easy way for us to think about them. North half, south half. Today, city, state, but in the state, it's also in this county, but also this city is this big, but it's like these people are attacking this. Who fucking knows? I guess you could have the left coast in the northeast, I guess, with pockets of cities elsewhere. It's very strange. Either way, if you don't know who your friend and your ally is, it makes things really difficult. And back to the original point of kicking the can down the road, well, everything was getting kicked down the road to the point where the government was just going to be super big. But with Trump coming in there with a sledgehammer, is it really possible that crisis could be averted this time? I mean, he's only been there 2 weeks and he's seeing massive victories. Things we've wanted for years, but nobody's had the balls to actually put in there. And this is just the start. Another point when we look at the Civil War is both armies were really not like these grand armies. They both had serious issues. Mainly both were extremely unprofessional and untrained. Trying to feed them was a huge pain in the ass. And that, well, most of them were just civilian recruits. Farmers and lots of blue-collar folks, all of a sudden switching to go off into war. And let's not be mistaken, the North wasn't necessarily super against slavery as much as it just wanted to preserve the Union. If 2 months ago you'd asked me what the conflict would have been between, it was really looking like it was going to be between these kind of communist, lefty, let's destroy the Constitution, make sure there's no personal property rights. And it would have been between the, I guess, more rural, try to uphold the Constitution, what the country was basically founded on, and have property rights and civil rights. And now with Trump outing the bureaucracy and trying to destroy the leftist establishments, I don't know, it seems a little too good to be true that we're just going to ride off into the sunset and that everyone's hunky-dory. Anyway, between some similarities of the Civil War back then and what might come out today, are that, well, even though we've all played a shitload of Call of Duty, does anyone really want to go to war? It seems like the right would be more willing to go to war, just in the sense to preserve the Constitution, give me liberty or give me death. That probably still rings fairly true within most of the people that voted for Trump. But when we look at the left and the 74 million people who voted for Harris, how many of them are really willing to fight it out? I mean, like I said, we've all played Call of Duty, but are they really willing to kill for that? And again, I'm talking about the general left. I'm not talking about the fringe communist Marxist left. They're more than willing to kill for whatever they want. They'll start riots and protests, and there's plenty of violence, and they love pushing the envelope as it is. But that's a very small fringe minority. And when we look at the morale of both the left and the right's probably more willing to fight. However, when you compare it to the time of the Civil War, right before when they had just fought the Mexican-American War, and our own timeline, finally just left Afghanistan only a few years ago, which was a total disaster, and it concludes the chapter of the Iraq-Afghanistan debacle. That means in my whole lifetime, for the most part, we were in Iraq and the Middle East doing stupid shit we should never have been doing in the first place, just to go get oil. The thought of war at this point could not be more demoralizing. That had nothing to do with defending democracy or blah blah blah, whatever that garbage is. Instilling democracies in countries that don't even want them. Like, do I really want to go fight some wars right now? I mean, I guess I would if it came down to defending the Constitution and making sure it's actually upheld. But I mean, look at the state of people today. We have a lot of fat people who don't know how to control their weight. There's a massive amount of people who are just NPCs and don't think for themselves. I mean, you mean to tell me that someone from that kind of category is willing to sit and fight for the Constitution or against it? The state of people is pretty miserable right now, I'd say, overall. Yes, there's still plenty of elements of good and plenty of people who would be capable of fighting, but compared to the average population back then, it seems like today's a lot more of a disaster and demoralized group of people who don't really even want to fight. And for all intents and purposes, can't fight. They're so dependent on the government and other people trying to solve their problems, and they won't do anything for themselves. Of course, this is a huge generalization. It seems like there's a healthy amount of people in that demographic, no pun intended. But at this point, do we really want to have war? It would be so nice if we could just resolve this through voting and working with the other side on common ground, but we don't have common ground anymore. And when common ground disappears, it really starts to feel like war is the next best option, which is horrible to say, but that's just what it feels like. I mean, the right would be a little bit more accepting of war just because, you know, they're not afraid of guns, they love the Second Amendment way more than the left does, and they know what gender they are. How is someone supposed to figure out how to reload a gun when they can't even figure out what gender they are, or they support people who do the mental gymnastics that that say there's more than two genders. So let's pretend that Trump does do something that either completely ousts or isolates the left or the bureaucrats way more than they already have. I mean, it could definitely spark something. But then that begs the question again, what does civil war look like in today's day and age? Another huge difference between the Civil War and today is the government has way more power than it did back then. Like today, it's got all sorts of weapons that civilians don't have. Tanks, satellites, control of GPS. They can really just track your movement as long as you have your phone or something like that on you. I mean, how would you even fight the government? They have the Navy, they have the Air Force, and civilians, I mean, we can own guns, but at the end of the day, our guns don't do a whole lot to tanks and those kind of big armored war types of ships. So when we look at the strategies of the North and South of the Civil War, both are trying to bankrupt the other and therefore forfeit, because an all-out war would have been just brutal. Today, the government can really just print its infinite amount of money if it really wanted to, and they would obviously side with the left as we've seen over and over again. But I don't know, this is all really complicated, and with all these new variables, it's very hard to do a direct analysis in comparison. It's almost like comparing apples to oranges in a lot of ways from the Civil War and what might be happening today. The last thing I want to touch on is when we look at the major conflicts of America, right? The American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. Two of those three conflicts were exclusively internal based. Don't forget at the time, we were really part of Britain in 1776 and 1773. So the American Revolution was really breaking away from Britain. And of course, our strategy was not to outdo the amazing British Army. Our strategy was to bankrupt them and just make it impossible for them to go across the entire Atlantic Ocean and keep coming after us over and over. I know, it's a great strategy, run out the clock. But that was internal. When you look at the Civil War, it was North versus South, once again, exclusively internal, over the debate of slavery, and the South was so hurt that they broke away from just Lincoln being elected, more or less. But World War II is different, right? Because when we look at World War II, yes, there was an extreme depression right before, and that was internally based, or a lot of it was. The external threat of Hitler being in Europe was very bad, but it didn't actually bring us into the war until 1941 when the Japanese struck us at Pearl Harbor. Then we split off into both campaigns. So it ended up being an external conflict, but it did have the depression right before. Some comparable things between World War II and today. The economy sucked from 1929 until World War II. That's very common knowledge. We've gone over it many times in school. Life here was brutal. When we look at life right now, in the year 2025, the economy really fucking sucks. After COVID and the stupid fucking bullshit we did with printing shitloads of money and then giving people stimulus checks, things have obviously not recovered and everything has gone crazy. I can't go to the grocery store without spending basically $20 at bare minimum just to pick up a few things. $20 is the new $5. And even though Trump's doing great things, I just don't see how we're going to be able to go back to pre-pandemic economic times. So with that said, the economy certainly seems like it could just explode at any moment. And that seems to be one of the good indicators of when a major conflict occurs. Maybe we all just go into the sunset and sing Kumbaya and the bureaucracy dies. And that was that. And the next guy who comes after Trump does the exact same thing Trump was doing. We just have this iron-fisted group of people after who never want to allow the bureaucracy back in. It was hard enough to get Trump in there. And at that, Trump had to get politically attacked after his first term for him to realize you have to put them on the chopping block. And you never know, it could be a lot more like World War II, which might just be more common these days. Economic downturns, and then you add in another dictator or someone somewhere across the world going into other parts of the world, annexing them and taking them over. We haven't gotten that far yet, at least not in a very direct, overt, supreme conflict sense, but it's not like it can't happen. What's this up? Xi Jinping going right across the aisle, right over to Taiwan and taking that over tomorrow. Of course, Trump being in the office, he's more likely to defend it, I guess, than Biden would. But that is just a whole can of worms that do we really want to open? Do we want to get involved in that war? I guess Putin and Ukraine are finally coming to some sort of resolution. But I don't know. If we had a crystal ball, this would all be a lot easier. And now, friends, to end this, some words from the Fourth Turning. This is from page 266, and this is probably the most important part of the book in my opinion, but it talks about major pre-conflict era of the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II, and what people were thinking right up to it. In 1920, Americans had polarized into competing moral camps in a mood of alienated pleasure-seeking and was settling in. Could people have envisioned the economy crashing down on the heads of a short-sighted, risk-taking public? Possibly. What about global depression, political upheaval, and another world war worse than the last? No. In 1850, a new South-North compromise had just been worked out, and the Republican Party did not exist. Could people have envisioned an incipient abolitionist party seizing the White House, the Republicans? Possibly. What about a horrifying national hemorrhage, a civil war bloodier than any known war in history of mankind? No. In 1764, England still pampered its New World colonies and forbore them from making inhabitants pay full cost of their wars and governance. I guess there was, the French and Indian War? 7 Years' War? Something like that. Could people have envisioned heavy new taxes and an armed crushing of popular resistance? Possibly. What about a war for independence, the coalescence of 13 quarreling colonies into one new nation, and the creation of a constitutional republic? No. The same pattern applied to the three prior unravelings. Around 1660, 1550, or 1450, people could have envisioned the opening skirmishes, but not the ultimate upheavals. The point is, whatever's coming is probably going to be a lot worse than whatever we think. And Donald Trump smashing things up and trying to make things tolerable is fantastic, don't get me wrong. Maybe what happens is in 2028, some knucklehead gets elected, undoes everything Trump does, and then all of a sudden you have the right being extremely pissed off. We finally got the country going right in one direction, and they just turned it around like it was nothing. I mean, who knows at this point? It's just not that easy to see if it'll be internal or external. Like I said, 2 months ago before Trump got elected, I would have for sure said internal. Oh well, there's some food for thought.